Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Sampachandra Prasad Rao, and I'm a consultant ENT skull-based surgeon working at Manipal Hospital, Bangalore. Um, Glad to have all of you on the show, and thanks for joining us. And the topic today is quite an interesting one. It's something that is kind of a hot topic among the medical fraternity as well as the public, and I personally have used the title mucormycosis, an epidemic within a pandemic, and that's what it is. So, what is mucormycosis? Is it an epidemic? What are the characteristics of mucormycosis? What is the treatment? Is there a source? What is the exigency? What are the recommendations that the medical fraternity can provide to the executive, and what's the road ahead? So, these are some of the points that we will be discussing in today's presentation. Now, what is mucormycosis? What are the risk factors? What's the scenario of mucormycosis in India, and what's the pathogenesis of this particular organism? Now, mucormycosis is caused by mucormycetes, which are found in the environment, and they release spores that are easily aerosolized and dispersed. Most common genera are Rhizopus and Mucor, and these set of symptoms, or the disease itself, is caused by inhalation of spores. There are other forms by which the spores can get in contact with and infiltrate the body, they could enter the skin in the cutaneous forms of mucormycosis. Contaminated food can lead to gastrointestinal mucormycosis, and there are several other forms of more rarer forms, I would say, of mucormycosis that we will be discussing in the next few slides. Now, one needs to understand that mucormycosis is a very rare infection, even among the high-risk patients. So it's 10 to 50-fold less common than the opportunistic fungal infections such as Candida and Aspergillus. And the mortality rate, however, in mucormycosis is anything between 50 to 80%, in some series close to 100%. So that's how bad the fungus is, and that's the reason why today we are kind of all of the medical fraternity is perturbed by the sudden outbreak of mucormycosis during the second wave, the COVID wave in India. Now, one of the common risk factors for mucormycosis, and when I say risk factors, remember that fungal infections today, as of today, most fungal infections and fungal infections across the world are caused by both host factors as well as agent-related factors. So there is immunosuppression, and then there are agents which try to get into an immunocompromised host. So immunosuppression can be due to organ transplant, hematological malignancies, and long-term treatment with corticosteroids, and in extreme age, for instance, elderly patients, long treatment for cancers. All these can lead to mucormycosis, and this can be a predisposing factor. Mucormycetes grow best in acidic, high glucose environments, and therefore diabetes mellitus, especially poorly controlled diabetes mellitus complicated by ketoacidosis, is a very, very important factor in the development of mucormycosis. Now, what's the Indian scenario? It's important for us to know that mucormycosis in India is 50 to 60 times higher than in the West or in the developed countries. And in India, uncontrolled diabetes has been stated to be the most common underlying factor in all of the studies that have come out from the Indian scientific community. In developed countries, hematological malignancies, as I told you before, or organ transplant recipients, these are the people in whom mucor is likely to be seen. The annual incidence of mucormycosis in India was in the range of about 13 cases in the 90s, about 36 cases in the 2000s, and about 50 cases per year between 2000 and 2010. As of today, we have seen much more than this baseline of cases. And before COVID began, I would say in 2019, we had just about 150 to at the most 200 cases in in India. But as all of us know, today the total count stands at over 9,000. That's the official figure. I'm sure there are more numbers coming in. So 9,000 cases is where we stand today, and we are just 1/4 into the new year, and we're going to see many more cases in the following months in the year, and hence we are looking at a huge spurt in cases. So if it's 10,000 for this year, we could be easily touching 30,000 to 40,000 cases if the trend continues, and that's a very worrisome figure. Now, 2 to 26% of the cases in India are in immunocompetent host, and 26% is a fairly large number. We see this in the current COVID wave as well. We see a lot of younger people getting affected, and there could be reasons for it. COVID infection itself is supposed to be a contributing factor. Indiscriminate steroid use or steroid abuse, all these are factors, and we are seeing a lot of younger patients and immunocompetent patients developing mucormycosis. The other factors in the Indian setting that contribute to mucormycosis is known to be chronic kidney disease, pulmonary tuberculosis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Now, what happens in the pathogenesis of mucormycosis? The phagocytes are the most important defense mechanism as far as mucormycosis is concerned in our body. So the mononuclear and polymorphonuclear phagocytes form the first line of defense. They eat up these fungal elements, whether they're spores, hyphae, or whatever they are internalized, digested, and these mononuclear polymorphonuclear phagocytes are found in abundance in the upper aerodigestive tract, and thankfully for us, we are well protected, I would say, against mucormycosis, or for that matter, any fungal infection. Now, hypoglycemia is known to be a causative factor, and hypoglycemia or high diabetes levels, or diabetes ketoacidosis, which is the worst form of hypoglycemia, where the blood glucose levels are above 400, 500, and in such a scenario, the blood turns acidic, and this acidosis leads to some changes which can then affect or impair the defense mechanism of the body. So hyperglycemia, we know, leads to a situation where there is impairment of the ability of the phagocytes to move and kill the organisms. As you see here in the picture, the first picture shows that the phagocytes are eating up the organisms, thereby not allowing the fungal elements to get into the deeper tissues like the blood vessels, and where the fungi can cause irreversible damage. So steroid treatment too is known to affect the ability of the macrophages to prevent the germination of spores. However, the exact mechanism by which ketoacidosis, or any acidosis for that matter, actually facilitates fungus, or impairs the ability of the first line of defense mechanism of the body against the fungus is yet to be ascertained. Now, there's an important aspect here that one needs to know: the role of iron in the pathogenesis of fungal infections. Fungus tends to accumulate iron using siderophores. These are produced by the fungus, and they bind iron, they acquire iron, and then use it and bring it back to the fungal elements. And this is an integral part of the growth of a fungus within the body. Now, we know that COVID-19 infection or sepsis can lead to raised iron levels, and I'm coming to that in a while. So increased iron levels are seen in COVID infections, and that could be one of the predisposing factors in the development of mucor in a COVID setting. Patients with ketoacidosis to have a high risk of developing mucormycosis, especially the rhinoculocerebral form of mucormycosis. This is because systemic acidosis have elevated levels of available serum iron, because what happens is, when there is acidosis, the iron becomes unbound from the binding agents, and that leads to more iron content in the blood that the fungus can effectively use for its own growth and reproduction. One of the important aspects of mucormycosis and the hallmark of mucormycosis is angioinvasion. This is what makes the infection deadly, and that's why we see a huge mortality among patients with mucormycosis. Now, this means that the fungal elements, the spores and the filamentous forms tend to dig into the tissues, and they then infiltrate the nearest blood vessels. They cause microthrombus, and that leads to local foci of necrosis, leading to blockage of smaller blood vessels. And blockage of smaller blood vessels mean the more peripheral or the part of the body distal to this organ undergoes necrosis, decay, necrosis, and this leads to the black eschar that we most characteristically see in mucormycosis. So angioinvasion, that is invasion of the blood vessels, leading to blockage of the blood vessels, leading to distal ischemia, and that is what proves to be fatal, and that's what is difficult to control in mucormycosis, especially if it goes into deeper organs like the eyes and the brain. Now, one of the first questions we need to ask ourselves is mucormycosis an epidemic in India today? So we need to get into some of the statistics that are available to us. Now, in the West, and I've been there for a good 7 years, and I was working in London, Paris, and in Milan, and I've seen how infections are dealt with, especially fungal infections are dealt with in some of the establishments there. And I know, and it's also reported in literature, that 2 or more cases of mucor occurring in a short time should be invested as a probable epidemic. That's how serious it gets. Mucor is a rare infection, and we all know how bad it can get, how quickly it can move from, and I predominantly focus on the rhino oculocerebral form of mucormycosis. So in just a couple of days, the infection can move to the eye, and then in a couple of days to the brain, and that can prove to be near fatal. So guidelines in the West say that 2 or more cases of mucor occurring in a short time should be investigated as a probable epidemic. Now, in India, we've had over 9,000 cases. 9,000 cases are just the reported number of cases. And I know from my engagements with the establishment, with the government, with the ministers responsible for this, that numbers are still coming in, and updation is not happening from every part of the country on a daily basis. There's no real-time updation. Statistics are slow to come by, and I won't be surprised if this 9,000 unofficially is 15,000 cases as of today. Now, and most of the cases have sprung up in the last 3 or 4 months. I don't know if we are at the peak. I hope we are at the peak. So, because if you're at the peak, then there is a downside after the peak. So if it's the uphill part of the peak, or if you're at the peak, we know that the surge in cases happened in the last few months. There were mucor cases in the first wave of COVID that hit India, but there have been a far more number of cases in the second wave, especially in the last few months. Now, while in the West, 2 or more cases of mucor is quickly notified, and it is declared as a probable epidemic, or the sources is determined to be found. In India, we have definitely delayed. We have not reacted fast enough, I would say, and there's been a delay in declaring this as an outbreak, and only on May 20th has the government made this a notifiable disease. The second wave of mucor has definitely been deadlier. Maharashtra, this particular chart that you see on the right side is a couple of days old. I didn't find time to upgrade this, and I've been pretty busy in the last couple of days, getting into action and trying to do something about mucormycosis. Maharashtra has the highest number of cases as of now, followed by Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh. Karnataka has a lot more cases than that was reported 2 days back. 2 days back, it was 97 cases, and the number of people dying out of this was supposed to be 0. But I know that a lot of people have succumbed to this disease. And as far as I know, in Bangalore, there are in the whole state, there are close to about 500 cases in Karnataka. Now, we'll quickly delve into the characteristic of mucor. and what are the types and clinical features, and what are the treatment options in Mucor, before we go into more, I would say, a deeper discussion into what could be the reason behind this surge in the number of cases. Mucormycosis are predominantly of 6 types. Rhinoculocerebral mucormycosis is one of the most common types. It affects the nose, as I told you before. It goes from thereby the sinuses, and from there the nearest vital organ is the eyes. It gets into the ocular system, and from there on into the brain. And when it enters the brain, there's very little that can be done to save the life of the patient. The less commoner forms are the pulmonary forms, the cutaneous forms, the gastrointestinal forms, the disseminated forms. That is when the mucor gets all into the blood and moves freely into other parts of the body, causing what is called disseminated infection, leading to organ shutdown, multi-organ failure, and consequently death. Miscellaneous forms include small, sporadic incidences of infection in the nails, in the distal organs, and mucor, for that matter, can affect any parts of the body. Now, what is ROCM? As I told you before, rhinoculocerebral mucormycosis. This is the most common form, and this is commonly attributable to high diabetes status and ketoacidosis. But the real cause why ketoacidosis leads to ROCM and not, let's say, pulmonary or the cutaneous forms is really not known, because ketoacidosis is a generalized phenomenon. Why should there be an affinity for the nose and paranasal sinuses is yet to be determined. Neutropenic patients are more commonly susceptible to pulmonary mucormycosis than ROCM, and we see neutropenia in immunocompromised status and also in COVID. Now, patients in any systemic acidosis have increased availability of iron. Now, I told you before that I'm going to touch upon this in a little bit of a detailed manner. COVID patients have definitely higher iron levels in serum, and I told you before how iron is necessary for favoring, I would say, the fungal elements that have infiltrated the body. So in COVID, we have a heightened inflammatory state. We all know that COVID induces cytokine storm. The COVID infection per se is not the killer. The cytokine storm is the killer. The cytokine storm is the one which leads to the most severest of complications, and that is why steroid is used at a point of time when the physician or the treating pulmonologist or intensivist is sure that the cytokine storm is setting in or has already set in. So that is when steroids are used, and that is also the time when there is a hyperferritinemia. So when there is increased iron level along with steroid uses, that is the point when the patient is most vulnerable to a mucor infection. At the same time, that is also the time when the patient requires nasal oxygen therapy. And nasal oxygen therapy, we all know, is an integral form of COVID management, especially in the more advanced cases. Now, the slide on the right shows all the different forms in which gas is supplied to the patient, oxygen supplied to the patient. Now, if the gas is not supplied, humidified at body temperature, if it's not warmed and humidified and not nebulized into the nose, that can lead to non-humidified, cold and dry gas going in for a long period of time. And we know that gas is given for hours to even days, and this dry, cold gas can cause mucosal abrasion, and that can be a recipe for disaster. Antibiotic use. Now, ROCM, what is the first stage? The first stage symptoms are very, very similar to sinusitis. It's very rare to get people with with symptoms of mucor similar to sinusitis. Very difficult to differentiate between the two, and sometimes even difficult to confirm the diagnosis. So when some of the COVID patients have recovered, COVID with diabetes, these are the population that we are that are most susceptible. And when such patients develop symptoms of sinusitis, what they do is either self-medicate, take some antihistaminics, take antibiotics, and some of them go in for online consultations, and they are prescribed antibiotics because the symptoms are so similar to sinusitis. And when this happens, we are also simultaneously seeing commensal loss. I've been stressing upon this point for several weeks now. So commensal loss due to increased use of antibiotics or even abuse of antibiotics, because patients take antibiotics on their own, and I've personally experienced this. I do a lot of consultations offline, online, and a lot of people have already taken azithromycin, and and they come to us. So commensal loss leads to fungal growth. This is an established thing. So increased use of antibiotics decreases the more, for the layman, the more beneficial bacteria, the good bacteria, so to say, and that leads to some really evil forces there, like funguses and some really rare microbes, bacteria, and viral forms to proliferate, leading to susceptibility to mucormycosis. Now, at the same time, steam inhalation is something that is very common in the Indian population. A lot of us grew up being told steam inhalation is good, and perhaps it is good in certain forms and in certain situations, but inhaling a lot of steam under these circumstances, where the nose or the nasal mucosa is vulnerable, is friable, is delicate due to the assaults in the nose, due to COVID, due to oxygenation, due to commensal loss, can be the perfect storm situation for setting off of mucormycosis. The symptoms are sinusitis-like symptoms, periorbital cellulitis. When the eye is involved, it's almost impossible to salvage the eye. There is conjunctivitis like suffusion, blurry vision, soft tissue swelling. Fever is variable. Fever can be variable, and but a high blood count is always there in all mucor situations. This patient came to me with the history of COVID 1 year back, and he had a black patch on his palate. He had not been hospitalized. This was a young patient, 30 years old, and he was not hospitalized, not on any form of treatment for the last many months, ever since he contracted COVID, for which he was hospitalized a year back. So this is the spectrum of patients we get to see. I've also seen patients who have not had COVID infections, but most of the patients are the usual suspects: elderly diabetics and people who are clearly susceptible to the disease due to high diabetic status. The infected tissue always appears black. When going forward, there is ischemia, as I told you, necrosis, decay of the tissues, distal or supplied by the blocked vessel, that is blocked by the fungal growth, and this leads to the black necrotic eschar, and that is a hallmark of mucormycosis. Now, progressive loss of vision, blindness, orbital accentration is more or less a given when the eye is involved. In the scan, you see that the one eye is all right, and there's a huge swelling in the other orbit, and there is a lot of evidence to prove that there is fungal infection in the nose, in the turbinates, and the eyes as well. Now, the final stage is when the infection enters the brain, and when it enters the brain, we then lose a chance to even debride. As long as it's limited to the sinuses, functional endoscopic sinus surgery can be done, debridement can be done, the tissues can be removed, and this can be of immense benefit to the patient. But once it enters the brain, we can't debride the brain, and that is when fatality sets in. In fact, fungal infection of the brain leads to meningitis and infarcts from the circle of Willis and branches of the internal carotid artery that leads to certain death almost. Now, it's very important to know that surgery is a treatment of choice, and along with antifungal treatments, and I'm going to come to this in this segment where we deal with both diagnosis and treatment. Now, what are the investigations for mucormycosis? I would say having a high index of suspicions, both by the clinicians or the radiologist, and definitely by the patient. The patient today is equally educated, and when made aware of what mucormycosis, and today there's a lot of awareness about mucormycosis, and that's probably also the reason that patients are coming in reporting, and we see the surge in cases. So a high index of suspicion has to be maintained by the patient, the physician, as well as the radiologist. CT scan is mandatory. HRCT of the paranasal sinus in the beginning shows sinus mucosal thickenings. I told you the symptoms are almost similar to sinusitis, and any evidence of intractable sinusitis, whether clinically or by radiology, in a patient with COVID, and diabetes, or I would go a step further to say in all diabetics, especially those with uncontrolled sugar level, should all be wary of a CT scan finding like this. Bone gets affected only in the later stages, and that is when patients have had maxillectomies, orbital excineration. I'm a skull-based surgeon. I've been called to do a lot of debridement in critical areas, including bony removal in mucormycosis. The investigation of choice is always an MRI, and I've been briefed about this by leading radiologists. My wife is a radiologist herself, and I was of the impression, and literature showed that contrast MRI was essential because of the fact that mucor leads to both necrotic and non-necrotic areas. The necrotic areas do not take up contrast, and that is how they show up. Both bright areas and iso-intense areas, which are classically called the black turbinate sign. But I was told by some of the radiologists that it's not really necessary to give contrast, and most good radiologists could pick up mucor with just T1 and T2 sequences. T1 sequences are iso-intense. T2 sequences show variable signals. 20% of the patients show high T2 signals. Fungal elements themselves tend to have low signals in T2, but a keen eye can diagnose mucormycosis with just plain MRI as well. If the patient can afford, a contrast can always be given. But it's histopathology that clinches the diagnosis, and that's the reason why the patient has to be brought down to the hospital. I keep telling my patients to visit the hospital within hours, not days, because histopathology is the only thing that's confirmative. In this case, culture, and we had intense discussions. I'm just coming out of a meeting with the health minister and expert committee that was called by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of Karnataka, and some of the top microbiologists there have told. There was a group that did a study in some of the leading hospitals in Bangalore, and they said that we did not find mucor in some of the critical areas, and they've been taking swabs for a few days now. But at the same time, we should know that it's difficult to culture mucor from swabs, and that's a unanimous opinion. So a negative culture from a swab does not rule out infection. Please bear this in mind. But at the same time, waiting for a fungal culture may also delay diagnosis. That can also delay diagnosis. We can't wait for the culture to develop. We need to be very quick with our treatment policies. So a biopsy, a minimal FES, a hospital admission, minimal FES, taking out necrotic area, or a biopsy would reveal what is shown here on the right side. So mucormycosis shows a characteristic wide ribbon-like aseptate hyphal elements which are at right angles, versus other fungus which have septae and which are at acute angles. It's quite characteristic, and if you give a biopsy, the pathologist will clearly be able to tell you whether this is a mucor sample or not. Remember that again, mucor is rarely isolated from cultures of blood, CSF, sputum, urine, feces. So it's really a tricky organism, and a negative sterile culture does not rule it. If there is a strong clinical evidence of mucor, go ahead and start treatment. Treatment obviously involves going inside the nose, and I'm limiting this discussion, being an ENT surgeon, only to rhinoculoscerebral mucormycosis. We see black areas. functional scopic sinus surgery has to be done. And this is where I reach out to the public and I tell them, do not fear surgery. Surgery is probably the only thing that can help prevent progression. And the reason being that if you believe that antifungals alone are enough, I'm sorry, that's not the case. Antifungals alone are not enough. And this particular study here clearly says that IV doses of heat-killed Rhizopus oryzae blastophores resulted still in a 40% mortality in diabetic mice. So if there is diabetes, instilling killed fungal mucor spores would lead to reactivation of spores and resulting in mortality. So this can explain the lack of efficacy of antifungal agents alone. It's very clear in literature that antifungal therapy alone is not enough. So for those out there in the public listening to this lecture, please remember that surgery is an integral part of the treatment protocol, and it's very important for you to know that surgery is for your benefit, especially in the stage 2, 3, 4, where there are sinus symptoms, where there are ocular symptoms. Surgery has to be done. The necrotic areas, the dead tissue has to be removed. Others, fungus grows in dead tissue. We all know fungus grows on decaying matter. So here is a clinical chart or guideline which we follow. So the initial phase, we begin antifungal therapy. Surgery is done whenever we find that there are huge debris, blackish areas. We go and debride the whole area as much as possible, do a kind of a wide debridement, and then we immediately start the patient on liposomal amphotericin B. But then again, liposomal amphotericin B is in short supply in the state and all over the country, and this is again a matter of concern, and we end up giving whatever is available. So surgery, diagnosis, surgery, and kind of trying to eliminate the other risk factors, tapering steroids, holding back immunosuppressive agents, controlling hypoglycemia, all these forms an integral part of treatment of mucormycosis. If the patient improves, then we can have a maintenance therapy with isoproconazole or posaconazole. Again, these are drugs that are in short supply. Posaconazole is available in some cities, but isoproconazole is definitely not available, and that's actually the second line of treatment in mucormycosis, and that's unfortunately not available in the country at this point of time. And all these are challenges that add on to the treatment and and the reason why they're not available is fungal infections were so rare in the past. Rare fungal infections means that even the pharmaceutical industries are reluctant to invest in huge factories that produce antifungals, because they don't know if this is a one-off thing. They are reluctant to invest, because if they, let's say, spend 100 crores putting up a factory, and tomorrow the mucor wave goes down and there is no more mucor, or if it goes back to baseline, then that industry would be producing a lot more antifungal drugs than is actually necessary for the treatment, and that would be a loss-making scenario. So it's a tricky situation, and we're all doing our best. I'm sure the government is doing its best, and the pharmacy industry is stepping up and responding to all the clarion calls that have been given and the SOSs that have been issued. But yes, the deficit still remains. Now, some of the unanswered questions that strike me and has posed or vexed the medical fraternity is, now, why do we have such mind-boggling numbers in such a short time? We had cases at the first wave. Other clinicians and microbiologists, I didn't see too many cases, just a couple of cases. But when I interacted with a lot of people out there, they saw cases, but obviously not in the thousands. Why is COVID-19 associated with the mucor and not aspergillosis, and which is one of the funguses that we see abroad, and it's one of the most common fungal infections in immunocompromised patients? Why not an aspergillus outbreak? Why not a candida outbreak? And why does it affect healthy young adults too? Do the immunosuppressants like tocilizumab and the steroids, do they cause immunosuppression to the extent that would lead to such a huge outburst of mucor? And And we have always been the diabetes capital of the world. Diabetes has always been there. All our ICUs have been filled with diabetes patients. It's a routine scenario in a busy ICU like the hospital that I live in, Manipal Hospital in Bangalore, to have a lot of patients in the ICU who are diabetes, some of them being uncontrolled diabetes, and many of them even with ketoacidosis. And we have not seen Mucor in this population in the past. Now, in this particular study that was done in 2015, this is a very important study on fungal outbreaks in general in the past. And this table goes on for several pages. It goes on for 3 to 4 pages. So outbreaks from 1976 till till 2015 have been researched into. And if you see, I'm just taking out the first page because it's a repetition from there on. If you see, a lot of infections have been aspergillosis. There's been aspergillosis. Immunocompromised states have been seen, and if you see here, almost every series have actually thrown up a source. There's been a reservoir or a source. You see dust from false ceiling from in a transplant unit, construction, road construction nearby, renovation nearby, hospital renovation nearby, building work nearby. And if you see the last paragraph here clearly enumerates the control measures that were taken by the infectious control boards in these hospitals that have immediately led to control of diseases. So now I would like to stop here for a moment. And if you see the first part of my presentation, and I've had this presentation before, and I've been maintaining from the beginning that, the source part of the discussion is as important as the host part of the infection. The host is an immunocompromised patient, and there's no dearth of immunocompromised patient in today's second wave of COVID in India, along with diabetes mellitus and COVID put together. But at the same time, the discussion on the source factor, which is an equally important matter in the control of an epidemic, is something that we have as a medical fraternity have not really put our fingers on. And this is the area which I would like to focus on in the second half of my discussion. So is there a source? What is the source? What could be the factors that lead to an increase in the maybe spore content, increase in the levels of mucormycosis in the air? Now, the factors influencing fungal colonization at work and at home and workplace is something that I'll first focus on. Now, I come from Mangalore. I come from a city within the coastline. Humidity is above 90-95%. Throughout India, we have a temperate climate. So this is in itself is a predisposing factor. Small areas of mold in a house in a city like Mangalore is not uncommon to see. And I grew up seeing my house being painted, whitewashed almost once in a couple of years due to the fact that the walls grew fungi. Now, this is a predisposing factor. Remember, in a country with a long coastline, and we see a lot of cases in Mumbai. That was where the first initial cases were reported in India. This too is a coastal city, and in a coastal city, when we are indoors in a lockdown setting, we are exposing ourselves to increased spore content in the air at home and at workplace. Now, so this part of the discussion deals with how spores can go up in your own house, in your own backyard, I would say. So I would like to put this in perspective. So we are not talking about one factor alone. And the bottom line in the meeting that just got concluded just a while back in the this meeting called by the Ministry of Health and Family Affairs, we concluded that this is a multifactorial thing. If we focus unduly, maybe rightly so, on, but unduly only on the use of steroids, only on COVID factors, diabetes factors, we would probably be doing a disservice, because the patient related factors cannot be changed. We cannot wish away COVID, but if there is a tap which can be turned off, it is this, the source factors. And the source factors can be divided into community factors, nosocomial factors, and supply chain factors. I'm talking about community factors. What is in your home that could be a killer? What could be in your home that is the source of this epidemic? So again, air conditioning, plants, carpets, upholstery in your house. Now, all this probably was not so important when there was no lockdown, but today we are spending a lot of time indoors. Work from home is the norm. It's the new culture, and we will be in this setting for a long period of time. So increase in spore content in the air has to be looked into. Please go back home and look into your AC vents if you have vents like this. And this is not an uncommon situation in India. A lot of places have unhygienic AC vents, both at home and in the workplace, and we need to get rid of these elements immediately. Now, I would like to stress on the use of masks during COVID infection. Now, mask is a norm. It is a new way of life. It is what saves. It is what is saving the world. It is going to be the norm for several months, probably years to come. Okay, so mask use is important, but the way in which the mask is used in India needs a lot of attention. I know people around me. I see people on a daily basis using masks for days together, for weeks together, till a brown debris sets on the mask. Please use your mask in the most sanitized way. The N95 masks are supposed to last only 8 hours. They're not supposed to be used for more than 8 hours. I myself have used an N95 mask. I'm guilty of having used an N95 mask for a day or sometimes even a couple of days, and this is not the right thing to do. The disposable masks, according to me, have to be used very judiciously. The cloth masks too. So I would like to tell the public, if there's any watching this presentation, that if you're using masks at home, whether it is a cloth mask or a disposable surgical mask or N95 mask, use it not for more than 1 day, 24 hours, and that's all. If you're using the same mask in a public area, if you're going out to the market, to a mall, come back home and discard the mask. Now, the reason why I'm telling you, and this could be one of the single most important factors, is because when we're using a mask, we what happens for a long period of time, we speak, we talk, we breathe out all this as moisture, saliva, microbes, and even food particles. So food particles, all this forms a layer on the inner surface of the mask, and this itself can lead to fungal growth. This is a agar medium for fungus. So we should realize this. In some of the younger individuals who are immunocompetent, whether they've had COVID or not, I believe that mucor can be due to unhygienic practices with mask use. Humidity itself is a concern. We sweat more in India, again, temperate climate, and now we are also using double masks. So using two masks at a stretch for a long period of time doubles the risk, and this is a single most important factor. Now, India's moved from being from not being a PPE producer to being the second largest PPE producer in the world today. So we have generated a huge industry in just about 1 year. Now, if we dwell into this subject, we know that a lot of units producing PPEs and masks come not from big industries, but from small household units, some of which work in not the most hygienic conditions. Some of these are in small households, in slums sometimes. And are we seeing a potential threat here? Regulation of mask and PPE equipment production. Who is the authority? Who is doing checks and places. The whole country is busy tackling COVID. We've had one of the worst waves, and we were in dire situation. So who has the time and patience to investigate and put checks and practices in place when it comes to PP manufacturing? So moving from zero to the world's second largest is not, it comes with responsibilities. So what are the responsibilities? So we need to make sure we wear masks properly. There are do's and don'ts, which all of you know. I've already enumerated on this, and the government needs to regulate the PPE manufacturing units. Now, I've dwelt on this subject, excessive use of antibiotics. Now, one of the things that I've been repeatedly saying in interviews is online consultations are the norm today. Online consultation means patients reach out to doctors at the drop of a hat. You know, if I open my online portal for 2 hours, and that's what was given to me in the beginning, and now I've kind of switched off from these portals. But when I tried it out for a few days, if I had 2 hours at a stretch, I couldn't put the phone down. So the online consultations went on, and the most mundane, the most silliest of symptoms were brought out to me. Patients are a little paranoid because of the COVID pandemic, and a slight itch in the throat, a slight sneeze, a little bit of a congestion in the nose or throat. Patients would pick up and call a doctor. And this practice means that we are now being superficial or superfluous also in our consultation, because we don't get to see the patients, we don't get to examine. So what do? We start giving empirical treatments. Empirical treatments means we say, okay, maybe you have sinusitis, maybe you have GERD, and then we drop in drugs, some of which is antibiotics. So there was always an abuse. Patients themselves were taking antibiotics. These were available across the counter, and now we have a situation where online consultations have probably made it even worse, and we end up giving antibiotics for just the fact that we have to give something, and that's not a good practice. And I myself shut off from this system because I didn't want to be a part of it anymore. So self-medication by patients also leads to commensal loss, and this is something I've already mentioned before. Now, excessive use of steroids definitely is a killer. Self-medication by patients, the second wave. In the second wave, general practitioners and patients themselves, started loading themselves with steroids. Steroids were available for in some of the places as an over-the-counter drug, which it should not. And a lot of people medicated themselves. A lot of general practitioners and even physicians, for that matter, started using steroids very early, while it should be used only when the COVID, the cytokine storm sets in after the first week. And when there's a definitive evidence of a cytokine storm. So steroids should not be used prophylactically when there are very meager symptoms, or when there are very, I would say, in the beginning, in the first 1 week of the COVID infections. And excessive use of steroids can cause mucormycosis. Now, steam inhalation. Now, this is a point where I want to dwell in a little bit. Now, it's been told, and this is taken from the net, the key benefit of inhaling, as mentioned here, is warm steam helps alleviate irritation, and it reduces swelling of the blood vessels, nasal passages. It is said that vapor thins the mucus and sinuses. It relaxes the throat, lessens soreness, inflammation, dilates the blood vessels, improving blood circulation. So this is some of the things which are available in the internet. And people I know across India are doing a lot of steam inhalation, and this has been one of the single most important piece of information that I've had in my 1 month of investigation into this whole mucor epidemic, I would say. And a lot of people, and one of the things I used to ask them, apart from COVID related factors, steroids, is the history of steam inhalation. And I've heard more than 60 to 70% of the people telling that they inhale steam not once but several times in a day. Now, what happens in steam inhalation? In steam inhalation, there is a very, very important point that needs to be brought out in today's discussion. Now, when steam is brought in with the nebulizer, the nebulized air has water vapor, and the size of water vapor is 0.0001 microns, whereas nebulized water droplets is in the size of 1 to 40 microns. Now, when we use steam, the steam comes in as water vapor, and then as it moves away from the heated devices, that is usually vessels in our homes, they condense on the face as they condense in the face as water droplets. The water droplets have the capacity to take in viruses, bacteria, and fungi, which are much bigger than bacteria, on the surface of the water droplets. And at the same time, if steam inhalation is done multiple times in a day, and we know that with our own practices, we know sometimes the steam singes the nasal mucosa. This, along with the fact that if this was a COVID patient with diabetes doing steam inhalation several times a day, and sometimes if there is a singeing of the nasal mucosa, that can definitely predispose to a nasal mucosal breach. The mucosa can rupture and lead to seeding of spore content into the nasal passages. Now, the public also are allowed to today buy oxygen concentrators. The government has allowed the public, but and a lot of people have asked me about oxygen concentrators. Now, it's a medical device. When you keep it at home, when you're using oxygen concentrators, you also need to know the sterilization techniques, and you also need to know very well that the water that has to be used in the humidifiers in some of these concentrators is sterile water or distilled water, and definitely not tap water. And I don't think a lot of people out there using oxygen concentrators are aware of this point. Methylene blue, I read, there was a viral WhatsApp which said that methylene blue can be used to sterilize the tap water that is used. Not recommended. This dye also can be inhaled and thereby causing load to the already fragile aerodigestive tract. Now, coming to the hospital factors. Now, the hospital itself can be a source of infection. As I told you, fungal infections in the West are purely nosocomial in nature. Purely, it's moved from being a community-acquired infection to a nosocomial infection. Now, what is nosocomial infection? Any infection that is acquired purely in the hospital, for which you're not admitted, you've been admitted for something else, and then you acquire something in the hospital, that's a nosocomial infection. Now, okay, let's talk about COVID. COVID is a community-acquired infection. That's the reason why we ask you not to go to the public places, and we give guidelines not to contaminate each other. So vis-a-vis COVID, mucor is a nosocomial infection. The highest frequencies of nosocomial infection is in the Southeast Asian countries. We see a much higher prevalence of nosocomial infections, which means that our hospitals need to be safer and make sure that immunocompromised patients do not develop, who are admitted there in the hospitals, do not develop a new infection, that is mucor or other fungal infections. And apart from patient susceptibility, I've touched upon this, diagnostic therapeutic procedure. From where do we get? From contaminated endoscopes, catheters, intubation, ventilation devices, surgical procedures. The environmental factors that we see today are crowded health settings. Our healthcare system is overburdened. There is very little patient turnover time. Are we sterilizing our equipments well, especially in smaller hospitals? Now, remember that all the mucor cases that I've seen in Manipal or most bigger hospitals are all cases that have come from smaller hospitals, from the peripheries, and practically no infection has been, as far as I know, reported in bigger hospitals, where there are more stringent guidelines for prevention of hospital infections. But mucor, remember, is in the West is purely a nosocomial infection. So to that extent, I once again urge the medical fraternity as well as the public to also look into the source factors. So that's the reason why I've been kind of highlighting the fact that we need to look at nosocomial factors. Is there a contamination? And we are taking concrete steps thanks to the government of the state in this direction. Now, if you look at nosocomial causes of reported mucor outbreaks, and these studies clearly show that linen, bandages, catheters, nasogastric tubes, surgery, medical devices, air filtration units, water contamination, construction, and plants within the hospitals have all been the single most important factors or source-related factors in nosocomial causes of reported outbreaks. So there's another slide where I'll describe about this in detail. Now, So there are plenty of things there in the hospitals that can cause, but that's supposed to be dealt by infection control committees, and the hospitals have to look into this. Now, what are the medical oxygen sources? Now, we also get gases. These gases come to the hospital from outside. A lot of high-end hospitals, tertiary care centers have in-house oxygen plants. Now, let me pause here for a second and discuss a very important factor that could have been overlooked in this huge surge of cases in mucormycosis. Gas comes into the hospital in form of cylinders. Oxygen concentrators are used to generate gas. Oxygen, I would say, oxygen plants, in-house oxygen plants are what we see in most big hospitals, tertiary care centers, and liquid oxygen producing facilities are out there, and from there this is transported through cylinders into the medical system. Now, we all have seen that oxygen cylinders are not kept in the most hygienic conditions. These are kept in dingy rooms with minimal ventilation, and there are guidelines that tell us that deal with how these devices have to be kept, stored, transported. And I know for a fact that this is not being done optimally. I've been investigating this for a month or so. I've spoken to a lot of gas distributors, operators, and hospital authorities, and I know that especially in the smaller hospitals, the cylinders are kept in unhygienic conditions. And if you look at this picture, that kind of is a telltale story. A cylinder kept in a condition like this, when it is brought to a hospital setup, and if one of these cylinders makes its way into a critical area or goes right next up to the patient, it can definitely harbor not only mucor but just about anything. So once again, touching upon the subject that in our meetings that we've had in COVID control committees, COVID task forces, mucor task forces, which now have been set up by the government of Karnataka, in which I'm a member, we have all discussed and seen that reports of cases have always been from smaller hospital peripheral centers, and the tertiary centers in Bangalore so far have not reported a single in-house outbreak, which means that we have not reported a case which was treated in the same hospital and has got mucor. It's always been a referred patient. What can go wrong? Humidifiers, again, when the turnover time is less, especially in the smaller hospitals, humidifiers may not be maintained cleanly. The humidifiers always have to be used in such a way. There are these things have to send in air, nebulized air at body temperature. So if you're just using tap water or cold water in a humidifier, those are just bubbles or some water condensation that comes up. Those don't really humidify. If you don't use humidified air, these dry gases themselves can cause nasal mucosal breach, and that can lead to contamination of spores which are waiting to get into the nose. Now, it's also a myth that the oxygen or gaseous forms go only in one direction from the pipes into the patient, but the patient also breathes out air. Some of this air can get into the humidifier as well, and this has been told to me by some of the experts in this field, and it's a myth that there's only a unidirectional flow. Hence, we need to look at and these are tricky things. There's been a study in Bangalore by our microbiologists who have taken swabs from some of these places, and I know important experts have taken swabs, and they found that these did not have mucor spores, or they did not grow mucor. But again, as I told you, growing mucor is a tricky business, and a negative mucor culture does not mean that there is no mucor. Now, this is a broad overview of how the outside air is pulled into, I mean, this is a long story. I mean, it's probably not the outside the purview of today's discussion, but suffice it to say that contamination can occur in the atmosphere, in the rooms where air is drawn in from, in the compressor, and then the distribution setup. And studies abroad have clearly shown that ICU had highest bacterial count, whereas the fungal counts were always high in the emergency room, and the COVID patients are always brought into the emergency rooms first. That's the point of entry of all COVID patients. Now, this is a place where I want to just stop for a minute and discuss this in detail. Now, when I first started investigating this story, I was told, and the point where I began was when the intensivist and when my anesthesiologist told me that gas has to be sterile because it's produced in cryogenic temperatures. It is cryogenic air, and so whatever the production unit always produces oxygen gases in inhospitable microbial conditions, minus 150, minus 140, 180 degrees, and they don't harbor and they cannot harbor bacteria. So, and when the gas comes out, the manufacturers always say that pure gas, 93%, 99% pure gas is what comes out. Now, when we talk about certified purity of gases, and we're talking about Western literature here, Western guidelines, and these are very stringent guidelines. So they say that even when those certifications, this is a paper in a point, when they say that when you're talking about purity of gases, 93, 99%, that's only of the purity vis-a-vis other gases, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen. It does not take into effect particulate matters, foreign bodies, bacteria, and they're not a part of the usual certification process. And culturing of the medical gas is hardly performed. And it's very important to culture, because if there is contamination, then we know that medical gas is a result of compression of gas, compression of 8 cubic feet of atmospheric air into 1 cubic feet of compressed air. And when you're compressing air, if there are contaminants, all the contaminants are also compressed, and there is a very concentrated form of contamination, which is bad if it turns out to be that fungal spores are contaminated. And some of the documented contamination of pipelines includes dirt, sand, gravel, cement, rust, vermin, cigarette butts, and wood. And in one cases, maybe anecdotal, but it is a case in point, that the largest particulate matter recently found in a gas manufacturing unit was a bird that was sucked into the medical gas system as a result of faulty construction. Now, one very important aspect, and if you see the timeline of the surge in mucormycosis, is also the fact that when there was critical deficit in oxygen supply in hospitals, the government turned to the industrial manufacturing units for supply of oxygen. So a lot of nitrogen and argon gas manufacturing units, which are automobile units and other food processing units, were asked or requested or mandated to be converted into to supply medical grade oxygen. So this is a phenomenon that happened. This has led to a lot of this has saved a lot of lives. I commend the government for taking appropriate steps, timely action, and a lot of lives have been saved by this move. But has an alien crept in and inadvertently have we let in a source of mucormycosis? Now, if you look at the one organization which has laid down guidelines, and that is PASO, Petroleum and Explosive Safety Organization. This organization that laid down guidelines for the conversion of used LNG tankers for oxygen services. And in its guidelines, the first sentence clearly says that since such conversion is not a safe practice and not followed internationally, extreme precaution has to be taken by the applicant for such conversion. So there is a caveat right on top, and then on the guidelines follow, and one of the guidelines say it has to be sterilized. But so this is the process of how the gas is produced and how it reaches the healthcare facility. You see, there is a long transport chain, and contamination can occur in some of these steps. And are we ensuring that the new industrial oxygen units that are supplying the oxygen that is supplying being brought into, and these are brought in by means of cylinders, and cylinders go to the smaller hospitals. As I told you, the bigger hospitals always have in-house units to produce oxygen. So the smaller hospitals are susceptible for contamination if the cylinders and other things are not really sterilized well. Now, the government has also relaxed the rules for manufacturing of oxygen tanker cylinders by asking them to start production facility first and then applying for the license. So see, there's a huge dearth of oxygen. We saw people dying on the streets due to the lack of oxygen a couple of months back, and today we are in a much better position. The bringing in of industrial gases and all the efforts by the government has paid off, and that has saved life. But has alien, a mucor element being infiltrated into the system, and that needs to be seen. Now I'm bringing in some discussion here, how fungi is related to nitrogen, because now we know that a lot of nitrogen units are being converted into oxygen units. So my kind of looking into this subject showed that fungus, nitrogen is an essential requirement for the growth of fungus. A couple of articles here and there have emphasized on the role of fungi in the nitrogen cycle. So again, there are I would put in a caveat here before we and I believe that there should be a look into this process of conversion of industrial oxygen into gaseous units to be producing oxygen. Now, a lot of people have told me that liquid oxygen cannot harbor spores, but there are articles which clearly point out otherwise, that say that spores can survive cryogenic temperatures. And in fact, the American Type Culture Collection Committee recommends that transportation and preservation of fungal spores be done in cryogenic storage at -130°C. So when fungal spores are being stored in cryogenic temperature, that clearly shows that they survive those temperatures. And in this particular slide, you can see that viable and unmutated cultures were developed from reactivated specimens from cryogenic sources for as long as 5 years. So it's not true that fungal spores which may contaminate the gaseous processes do not survive cryogenic temperatures. Now, again, some of these documents, I'll just brief through it. I have a lot of data. The European Industrial Gases Association guidelines, which has done study into their own gaseous systems, have clearly shown that there has been contamination in their gaseous forms, and they have actually taken swabs from the inner surface of cylinders and from the gaseous supply chain, and they have mandated that maximum values of 100 colony forming units per Newton meter cube and 50 colony per Newton meter cube are what is permissible for bacteria and fungi respectively. So if you're talking about fungal growth, we are talking about 50 CFU per Newton meter cube, which are so have we done these analysis in our samples? As far as my research go, microbiologists have not done this in the past, even when there was no COVID, and some of these require specialized techniques, and this is perhaps something that we need to look into. Now again, more and more data saying that at -170 there has been growth of microorganisms. All this, I can go on and on. Clear evidence that the results indicate that the microbial load remains adhered to the internal walls of the cylinder, the gas cylinders, and this is what has been the rules laid down by the Asian Industrial Gases Association. So there were a series of protocols. I do not think this is being followed strictly in all hospitals. Gas cylinders need to be disinfected. Handling has to be done with personnel wearing PPE kits. I don't see this happening because the turnover time is so short. Cylinders go in and out so fast that it's so easy for these cylinders to be contaminated. Some of these cylinders are reach right up to the doorstep of the patient, right up to the bed of the patient. Now again, all guidelines I can throw, and these are all things that we have researched. I don't want to get into this. So at the end of the day, what is the bottom line? What is the exigency? What do we do at this point of time? We have looked at diabetes mellitus, we've looked at patient sources, we've looked at community sources, we've looked at nosocomial sources, we've looked at gas line sources. What do we do now that we have raised so many red flags? Now, a case in point is this particular investigation in an outbreak of mucormycosis in a pediatric oncology unit. So if you look at this particular case report from Nottingham, UK, this case showed a few cases of mucormycosis, 2 to 3 cases if I'm not wrong. And when this happened, there was an immediate investigation into the source, and what was seen was this was secondary to water damage in a linen store and patient shower room. The source of the contamination was identified, closed, and timely sampling allowed successful implementation of infection control process, and the infection was stopped and patients were protected. Now, if you look at the incidence of outbreaks of zygomycosis, mucormycosis in hospitals outside India, and this is a series which dealt with 12 hospital outbreaks, you will see that the number of cases have been so less, 3 to 1 to 1, 5. So the maximum is 5. So even when there were 2, 3, 5 cases, the infection control committees were set up, they were activated, and the most important thing that they did was to find the source of infection. Every single series has described the source. Almost every single series of fungal outbreaks in the past outside India have been have led to a source, and this is something we have to strongly look into. Not just blame it on COVID and intellectualize the discussion only on COVID and COVID related factors. We know that that is true. We accept diabetes mellitus is a factor, but if you look at what's happening in a fungal infection in other countries, and we can take draw lessons from them, they always trace it down to a source, and the source is switched off, and the epidemic is controlled. So what needs to be done is to set up infection control programs in every single hospital till we are over and done with this mucor outbreak. So this includes one person in the management, microbiologist, physician, pharmacist, nursing staff, and it goes on to say that even the biomedical waste, the linen chief, the biomedical, the linen department representatives from also the canteens and the food supply chain, all these people should be a part of the infection control teams, and they are the ones who will go back and look into their systems and see where the contamination is happening. Now, if you see this particular chart, this is from a mucor epidemic, I would say, where 1, 2, 3, 4 cases, 5, 6 cases were seen. Now these epidemics were always recurring, and that's the reason why I'm saying we are not done. The cases may come down from 10,000 today to 2,000, but it will be a long way before we reach an old baseline of 100 to 150 or even 200 cases. So for this mucor wave to come down to 200 cases will take a long period of time, and that baseline itself is 40% higher than the baseline in developed countries. So we have a long way to go, and we will have recurring infections, and if some of these fungal spores contaminate permanently some of these systems, we are in for a long haul. So what have been our recommendations? We have divided this into three categories: patient responsibilities, community responsibilities, and hospital responsibilities. So what are patient responsibilities? The patients themselves should have a high index of suspicion and alertness for mucor signs and symptoms, especially in COVID or post-COVID patients, especially in COVID patients with diabetics. And I would go one step further to say in diabetic non-COVID patients as well. So if there is any indication of severe sinusitis, resolved sinusitis, intractable sinusitis, nasal symptoms, eye symptoms, do rush to a ENT surgeon, pulmonologist, infectious control specialist, dentist, maxillofacial surgeon. These are all the people who deal with these infections. Not wasting time is of paramount importance. It's very important to report within hours, not days, because 2 days is all that it takes for this infection to reach a stage where a point of no return. But do not panic, because if you're careful and if you keep monitoring yourself, you could be in for an early diagnosis, and that leads to good results. Another very important factor is surgery. Remember that if there are debris, and if you're in a slightly, I would say, mid-range, not the most advanced stage, then surgery is a life savior. Removing the disease, removing the necrosed part is absolutely essential. Do not fear. I've lost a couple of patients because they did not reach out. They feared surgery. I mean, when I told them that, you come down, we need to do a FES and visit the hospital, the fear of surgery kind of let the patient to come in late, and then things were a little different from there on. Avoid self-medications, avoid using steroids across the counter, antibiotics. If you are infected, if you have recovered, please go back home and try to see what's happened, analyze yourself, and try to give us data which would probably help other patients. The community responsibility should be, first thing, use masks in a proper way. Please make sure that you do not prolong the use of your mask. Masks have to be sterilized, thrown, disposed, and reused. There are reusing protocols as well that can be followed. And that can be for another day. But you can use the same mask provided there are techniques to sterilize it. So use masks in a sanitized way. Avoid self-medication again as a community. Avoid steam inhalation. Anything that is done in excess is bad for the body, especially in COVID patients, post-COVID patients, post-COVID patients with diabetes. Steam inhalation can wreak havoc on a fragile nasal mucosa. Again, using oxygen concentrators should be with distilled water. Sterilize it often. Sanitize your own environment, air conditioning, upholstery, carpets. Avoid plants. Do proper waste disposal. If your waste disposal is not happening on time because of the load on the waste collectors, because they're facing immense stress, because there is load coming in from the hospital, homes, if they don't come up on a daily basis to collect your waste, at least make sure your wastes are kept outside your home and you don't keep breathing in a lot of spores. And definitely follow general sanitization protocols. Wash your hands a million times a day. I do that all the day. I lose count on how many times I wash my hands. So that's very, very important. Now, the hospital and institutional responsibility, as I've enumerated, should be to determine the contamination of source, because that's what is done in all epidemics. We have a host factor, and we keep focusing on treating and finding out what's wrong with the host. We lose out on the chance to determine source-related contamination, and that's very important. Check your oxygen supplies, sterilize your equipments much better than before. Get your infection control teams to check, double check, cross check. Educate your own medical staff. I've been talking to almost everybody I meet, nurses, as we go down the clinical chain. A lot of people inside our own hospitals are not aware of, I would say, 80% of what I've spoken to you about. And that's a clear and present danger. Our nurses should be told what to do. There are a lot of young nurses coming in. A lot of people are getting infected. There's the turnover time is less, inexperienced nursing staff. So there's a huge load on the system. And our medical staff should be told about mucormycosis. And all hospitals today should have mucor cells. And that's the only way where we can have a coordinated attempt at reporting to the authorities. Coming to the authorities themselves, executive responsibilities are to first declare mucormycosis an epidemic. That is when the SOP is set down, epidemic SOP is set down, and infectious control teams will be activated. Hospitals will be mandated to look into the source. Report and have constant communication with higher organization, WHO, UNICEF, and all the other organizations which can possibly help you. They would have guidelines, experience in dealing with this matter. See what other countries are doing. Maintain a national database. This is happening now. This is not perfect. We are yet to get put in all the elements that need to be analyzed. We are still very, 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 I would say, sporadic and in the data coming in. Now the numbers are coming in. Numbers doesn't mean that the data follows. We need to ask, we need to put into our database all the things that we've discussed. Do they take steroids? What is the hospital administration time? And what has been the possible source of infection? Postulate and investigate possible sources. Do not neglect this. We will do this at our own peril. Check oxygen manufacturing units. We may or may not finding, but it's still worthwhile checking them, and use this as an opportunity to put an SOP in place where there was none. Check your hospitals, check the PPE manufacturing units. As I told you, a huge industry has come up in a short time. Go back and make sure these people are using sterile SOPs, and check the oxygen supply chain. Ensure adequate supply of drugs. We are having a shortage of drugs. Government is trying its best. Having been in the inner circles of the government agencies, I know that the government is trying very, very, very hard, mind you, to make sure the government is on its job. I'm actually very, very surprised by what I have seen, and this have been a few meetings that I've been involved in. I practically don't have time, because there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that the establishment is telling us, the Deputy Chief Minister of Karnataka, the Health Minister of Karnataka is telling us, you experts have to make sure that the hospitals are safe places once more. So the international community, the national, our own patients, our own industries, and the whole world feels again that India is a safe place to be. So thank you, one and all. It's been a wonderful experience, and it's been a thrilling task for me to go through these presentations again and again, because as I discussed this, I myself get enlightened along the way. Thank you, Cipla, for organizing this. Thank you one and all for being a patient listener to all what has been told in this talk. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Hello.